Good morning and welcome everyone to Iowa Ideas. Happy you chose to be here with our group with so many great sessions to choose from as we start out the first bit of conference. This is the Outdated Systems and Housing panel within the DEI and Community Development tracks. As a reminder, the session will be recorded and thank you to our sponsor, Inclusive ICR, for your support.
Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to check out our website at inclusivicr.org for upcoming events and our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
To introduce myself, my name is Marissa Payne. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Gazette Cedar Rapids government reporter. I'll have the panelists go around and introduce themselves as well. And we'll start with Eric.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. My name is Eric Burmeister. I am the executive director of the Polk County Housing Trust Fund, which covers most of the Metro Des Moines area in central Iowa.
And Allie?
There we go. My name is Allie Parrish, and I am the Executive Director for Iowa Heartland Habitat for Humanity, and we serve 4 counties in Iowa. We are Blackhawk, Bremer, Butler, and Buchanan counties, and I've been with the organization since December of 2013. And so we provide home ownership, affordable home ownership options for families, both on the purchasing side, mortgages, as well as on the home repair side or home modification side of things, helping families that already are owners to have affordable repairs and modifications as well. And I'm excited to be with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And then Sara.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I'm not with you visually right now. Maybe we'll be able to get that taken care of, and maybe we won't. But I'm Sara Barron. I'm the director of the Johnson County Affordable Housing Coalition. Our organization is focused on community education and advocacy and partnership development, all in support of housing that's affordable for people who are lower income in Johnson County.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being here with us. Let's get right into our discussion. Please note, our audience members, that you are welcome to submit questions throughout, and I will work those into the session. So this session will address outdated systems such as credit scores, redlining, and other access issues that prevent Iowans from accessing secure housing. So to start off, let's establish some context for everyone. I mentioned some of those access issues that people are facing, but what is the history behind those issues, and how have housing policies contributed to these barriers, and who has historically been disenfranchised?
So I'll go ahead and start talking a little bit about the historical context of all of this. In a larger perspective, if folks are interested in really delving more deeply into this, the Polk County Housing Trust Fund has established a separate educational website called Undesigned DSM, which takes a look at the historical impact of federal, particularly federal and local housing policy since the Great Depression, and how that has changed the look and opportunities particularly for homeownership in our community. So if you're interested in getting into the details, go to undesigneddsm.com. But generally know that the federal government has been deeply involved in single-family housing development and finance since the 1930s. And the policies that have been adopted at the federal level have greatly influenced what has happened in our country since then. And just briefly, what that means is that many of our homeownership opportunities, particularly for finance, and even for availability of homes, have been limited to white Americans. And that was written into federal policy and therefore has left out for now almost a century the folks of color, particularly African Americans, and now more recently our Hispanic neighbors, from the opportunity to build the kind of wealth that you build by being a homeowner.
Thanks, Eric. I love the work that your organization has done and talking about not just what happened historically, but what the consequences of that history have meant in present day. And it's great for people to understand that, that is not just something that we dealt with in the past that is over now. It's something that continues to shape our housing market today, who has wealth in their home and who does not, where people live, what we think about our neighbors and who should be living there. All of those things still persist today. And it's not enough, in my opinion, to say, okay, let's not do that anymore, right? We have to say, how do we fix the legacy of that in affirmatively fair ways? How do we repair the damage that was done? Because just simply saying, okay, well, now we're not going to do that anymore doesn't fix the decades of discrimination that are baked into our system.
Yeah, and I don't need to add a whole lot, but one thing, I'll just add from our area is, actually have had conversations with folks that were around in, Waterloo and other communities, but Waterloo in particular back, in the 60s, and African-American woman that actually works for us that is today 80 years old, and back in the 60s her husband was murdered actually, and she found herself to be a single mom and had to find a safe place for her family to live, and was in Waterloo and wanted to purchase a home. By all other means, standards, she was eligible to purchase a home, and yet she wouldn't have a realtor that would work with her, and she wouldn't have a bank. She couldn't find a bank that would actually lend to her. And so she had to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and finally was able to find someone who would actually sell a house to her. And she lives actually in that home still today. But so I had actually just gone to the redlining, undesigning the redline traveling exhibit that was in Des Moines, and it was very, very impactful. And had heard about, more and more and learned more and more about some of the redlining that had gone on, and had just pulled up our own Waterloo maps, our redlining maps, to see the actual areas that were designated. And this is exactly, and then heard this story from one of my own coworkers. So this is very real, to actually bring it more to current day and how it actually has affected people's lives. But when you actually look at the redlining maps for your own community, it's crazy to see, and then actually see the verbiage that came along with it, and some of the old federal policies, to actually see the verbiage in the documents that were in effect, very recently, actually, even that excluded certain populations, and certain races.
Yeah, and it's important to understand, Ally, that that's not just like unintended consequences of federal
Right.
policy, right? It was the
Right.
explicitly intended consequence of those policies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, we've only recently become politically correct. And
Right.
so the fact is that it is kind of jaw-dropping when you take a look at how explicit the language is in many of our federal policies right up until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, in terms of excluding folks that were simply not of the, as a lot of them say, not of the Caucasian race. And so it's startling to many, at least it should be startling to many, but it's also one of those things that I think is important when we talk about what our educational system looks like and how we teach our kids and future generations about the kind of legacy that our grandfathers and great grandfathers left us. Because unless you understand that, you come up with all kinds of reasons, at least in your own mind, as to why things are the way they are. You can simply take a look at Des Moines and say, well, why are all of the houses that are in the worst shape and conditions located in these particular neighborhoods? Or why do we find a disproportionately large concentration of African American or Hispanic households in certain neighborhoods? What causes all of that? And the thing of it is, unless you understand that this was the direct result of federal policies that explicitly said, this is how we want our cities to look, that is racially and economically segregated. Like I say, you come up with all kinds of different answers in your own mind about why it looks that way.
And I think it's important to note too the public-private partnerships that have shaped where we are today, because it's not just federal policy, it's also certain business interests advocating for that federal policy. And there's a great book that of course I'm going to blank on the name of right now, that talks about the ways that different business interests advocated for and supported these policies, including the insurance industry and banks and other folks. So it's certainly on the federal government for doing better, but they were not alone in making these decisions. And that also takes me to one other thing I want to point out, which is we haven't talked a lot about rental housing right now, but I think many people have short memories about how prevalent public housing was in the not very recent past. And it's only been in the last few decades that we've moved to public-private partnerships to provide housing to low-income Americans as well. So, it was very common in the 1950s for public housing to be government provided housing, to be the source of stable, affordable housing for lower income families. Then we saw a move toward the Section 8 program, which provides vouchers for people to choose housing on the private market. There are a lot of really positive things about allowing people to choose where they want to live and integrate into different neighborhoods. But of course, that system depends on then the private market in ways that public housing does not. So you have to have landlords who are willing to rent to people with Section 8 vouchers. You have to have homes that are affordable and accessible to people on the Section 8 program, because they can't spend an unlimited amount of money in their monthly rent. They have to find something within the program guidelines. And so we start to see in that shift as well, the ways that we perhaps open our system up to the influence of the private market in ways that can exacerbate inequality.
You're exactly right, Sarah. I think that, and we've seen that here in Iowa. We saw that in Iowa last legislative session, where the what are called source of income ordinances that were in effect at a couple of our cities around the state were nullified or voided by the state legislature. said that the cities didn't have the authority to make those ordinances or require or to prevent landlords from discriminating against tenants that had housing choice vouchers. And so, yes, it without that program being mandatory for landlords, it does provide huge inequalities across not only different neighborhoods within a city, but different cities within a state.
And Eric, just to clarify what you're saying, because I think it's so important for people to understand, there was never a law that required private landlords to accept everyone with a Section 8 voucher. That's not the law. Rather, it's you cannot discriminate against someone solely on the basis of how they will be paying their rent, in this case with a voucher.
Yeah, so we kind of began to get into this a little, but as a result of these longstanding access issues, what is the impact that renters and homeowners are facing today? And what are the resulting implications of that for the state as a whole, that not all Iowans have access to secure housing?
What we know about the state of Iowa as a whole is that we only, you can look at someone's income, and based on their income, you can determine how much they can afford to pay for their housing each month, right? So in the housing world, we say that no one should be spending more than 30% of their total income on their housing costs. And so if you're someone who's working minimum wage in Iowa, which is still $7.25, in Johnson County, where I live, you would have to work almost 3 full-time jobs, you all, in order to afford a very modest 2-bedroom apartment in Johnson County. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about affordability. And so, we know that across the state, we do not have enough units of housing that are priced low enough as to be affordable to people at the lowest income bracket. Like, it starts to get a little confusing, but basically, if everyone was able to find a place that they could afford on their current salary, we would be about 1/3 of the units needed short of that metric. Now, on the other hand, we're overbuilt on housing that's available only to people at the highest income levels. So we know that across the state, there's a disparity in the price of housing relative to people's incomes. Just to kind of set the stage in that way. And as to what the consequences of that are, I would love to, let Eric and Allie weigh in.
I mean, one thing that, we talk about all the time is that if you don't have the ability to own a home and haven't had that ability to own a home for generations, then you really haven't had the ability to build generational wealth, since that home ownership piece is such an important piece. A lot of times the most significant asset that someone has is their home. And the ability to pass that wealth on, for generations. And if you've never had that ability, or you're the first home buyer that you've had in a long line of, family members, we see that all the time. We're working with home buyers on a daily basis right now that are the first home buyer in their family that they've ever had, So when that's not my story, that's not my story, that's their story. When our stories don't line up and they haven't had access the way that I've had access to be able to own that home, you're seeing that gap in generational wealth ability. The other piece is thinking on that lingering impact of redlining, certainly in our Waterloo community. And thinking back to what Eric was saying too on the why, a lot of times I think what we mostly fail at is not really trying to dig into why a community may be struggling, or a neighborhood may be struggling, or families may be struggling, but rather just try to place some kind of label or decide for them basically why these areas are having a hard time. But there's history there, and thinking on the Waterloo community example just itself, back when there was a farm crisis in the 80s, Waterloo lost a significant amount of its population when John Deere laid off a lot of workers and Rath Packing closed, and we went from 77,000 in population down to 65,000 in population in a very short period of time. So you had redlining going on in the 40s and 50s and beyond, and still today you had some areas that in Waterloo that had already been weaker real estate market because they had been redlined and just not had not seen the investment that other areas of town had seen. And then you had the farm crisis, and all of a sudden this population was wiped out. And so neighborhoods really started to suffer that were close to downtown and close to those manufacturing areas. And then you see slumlord into play. So you start seeing these outside investors, most of the time, not from our local community, a lot of times, that are buying up a lot of these cheap properties and then starting to turn them into really, a terrible rental situation. And then you have folks that don't have any other options, and then they're forced, because of affordability issues, to rent from these horrible landlords. And the condition of the homes just continues to deteriorate. And then it just goes on. And then families are stuck in these cycles and they can't get out of them. They don't have the affordability to do it. They don't have the credit scores. That's the other side. If they don't have trust with a financial institution, they don't establish a good banking relationship and a relationship with a financial institution. And that's how you can start to, have better access to credit and things like that, and a better relationship with financials that way. And so, we'll find families all the time that are coming in with, credit scores in the 500s or even 610, 620, and there's no financial institution that will work with them. But they just haven't, had the ability to do the things that they need to do, or haven't had the good relationship to be able to do that. So it's all of these factors, and it's just continuing this cycle on and on and on. But I would say, for the implications, I guess, without that access to secure housing, is then you just get these families that are just caught in this punishing cycle day in and day out. Hard to get out.
I'd also like to highlight some of the other non-financial consequences of not being able to afford your housing. So, even thinking back over the last 18 months, when the advice was stay home if you can. Okay, that advice depends on everyone having a safe home to stay home in. It depends on them having their water and electricity on, which we saw a lot of people who weren't able to pay had access to none or some of those things, right? So housing is also public health. It keeps people safe and stable. It improves people's health outcomes. It improves children's educational ability when they have a stable home. It improves our relationship to our community. It improves our economic success. All these things. It's very difficult to go and find a job if you don't have a place to go home to at night. It's very difficult to commit to going to work every day when you're dealing with evictions or instability in your housing in other ways. So the financial consequences are obviously very pronounced, but we need to recognize that our entire community fabric is strained when people don't have access to safe and affordable housing. And so it's tempting to say, well, those people need to figure that out, right? But we have to look as a community about how we are all stronger when everyone is safely housed, and we are all more vulnerable and less stable when we have neighbors who are facing that kind of instability.
I think that clearly housing is safe, stable, and affordable housing is foundational to all of our communities' general overall well-being. And the more unstable the housing situation in a community, the more that community as a whole is going to suffer. And we can go down a whole bunch of different avenues about what that means. But I think that clearly, I think you'll find that housing or lack thereof certainly has some impact on many of the current challenges that the state is struggling with. Workforce availability being one of them.
Yeah, and just given the current state we're in, still kind of in the middle of COVID-19, the pandemic has brought an influx of stimulus money, emergency rental assistance. There's the eviction moratorium for a time. So all these efforts that were kind of new to address people's housing needs. So how has this public health crisis revealed, some of these longstanding issues? And more importantly, in your guys' work, what have the takeaways been for you all in terms of, ways that we can maybe kind of systemize some of those things to help people obtain secure housing?
Well, I think first of all, just across the board, we've seen that the pandemic has exposed inequities in just about every category, not only housing, but health and education and access to childcare, all of those things that you can just go right down the list and see that our communities of color have fared worse in every single category. And so I think that, that's been eye-opening for a lot of us that are working in this area. But I do want to say that the good news is that the federal impact, or the impact of federal dollars from COVID relief and now from the American Rescue Plan has allowed us to build systems that help families and households with their housing crisis. And we know that there are solutions to folks' housing instability, and it is rental assistance. It is saying, yes, we will help you with your rent when you are unable to, or unable to pay it. And so I think that there's no doubt that the federal assistance programs, and hopefully the ones that are still coming, have been key to preventing a total meltdown of housing for our lowest earning Iowans, but also have actually put a number of those folks in a better place because of the pandemic. And we can talk about what it would take to extend some of those programs past the official end of the pandemic, if it ever is announced. But I do think that they are good direction pointers to the kinds of things that we can do to improve the lives of some of our lowest income households in Iowa.
Yeah, Eric said some of us might have been surprised by the inequities that were revealed during COVID. I can't say that I was terribly surprised by that, but I can tell you how enthusiastic I feel about the fact that we have shown that we can, in fact, act to prevent some of those very preventable housing crises for individual families and communities. So I know in Polk County, in Johnson County, and other places in the state, we have developed all kinds of new programs that are designed to keep people safely in their homes, using this federal money, but also using state and local dollars. And being able to prevent an eviction really means preventing homelessness, right? And so that's what we are doing right now. And that's what we must continue to do moving forward. We can't think of that any longer as something that we'd love to do, but we don't know where we'd get the resources for it. We can now see the benefits of keeping people stably in their homes, not, of course, the human benefits, but also it's far less difficult for a household and the community supporting it to recover from being on the verge of eviction versus being actually homeless and needing to get back into a home, right? It's less expensive to prevent eviction. It's so much better for the community and for the household. So we know that we need to shift those resources and create new resources that keep that happening after the pandemic. The pandemic has just been an opportunity for us to see what's possible and to act in new ways. And not a single person in the housing field will be satisfied if we just go back to doing things the way we were doing them before, because now we know that we have better options.
And that they work.
That's right.
Yeah, I would just say, during COVID, I think one thing that we felt is I guess just confidence in the way that our program ultimately does help families for the long haul, in the sense that we really had not very many families that were struggling, and actually nobody that became on the verge of a foreclosure or some kind of serious issue with their finances due to or their housing due to COVID. So I mean, there's a lot of factors that are involved in that, but I think it also speaks to when you give someone the opportunity to own a home that they can afford, and that home is kept in good repair and all those things, that they can withstand something like a global pandemic and even financial influx, what have you. So we honestly thought of it as just some really good successes there, speaking to the importance of this in general.
I love that you're saying that, Allie, because it really does reflect something that's so important, right? Because we had so many housing insecurity. I hate to use the word crisis because it makes it sound like something that can't be solved, and I don't want to give that impression, but there were so many people who were working beyond really what was sustainable to stay stably housed before the pandemic, right? So those folks were some of the first folks to encounter trouble when things started to shut down. And when we're talking about housing stability, the reason that affordability is so important to that is because it allows you to stay in the same place and be able to afford it every month for the long haul. And so affordability is, of course, important in its for its own reasons, but also the way that it contributes to stability for a household. I'm not on the verge of a disaster at the end of every single month. Okay. We've lived like that. We know other people who've lived like that. It's not sustainable, and it's terrible for our mental and physical health. So when someone can afford their housing costs, they're not worried about how they're going to pay that bill every month, whether it's rent or mortgage. That there's just a huge impact from that across the board. And we see now, I think, the scope, the depth of people who are barely hanging in every single month because of the pandemic. It definitely did reveal that in new ways.
I think from a personal perspective, one of the things that the trust fund did in partnership with Iowa Legal Aid, before the federal emergency rental assistance dollars became available, was to use trust fund dollars as well as county dollars to bridge that gap. And we actually sat down at the eviction court every day and wrote checks to landlords in order to get them to dismiss eviction cases for folks. And as part of that, had the opportunity to actually interact and listen to the stories of these families. And again, we all know sort of the general story, but when you sit and listen to folks, I'll just say to a mother who has got the system figured out, knowing down to the day what bill she can pay, and some months being only 1 month behind on rent, and other months being only 1 month behind on utilities or her car payment. It really is a high wire act for a lot of these families. And one little hiccup, like, oh, by the way, your hours are going to be cut this week because COVID has reduced the number of customers coming into the restaurant that you work at, is enough to knock you off that wire. And so the fact that we think that yeah, there are those people out there that have that issue, but not many. I will tell you, we listened to over 1,000 stories between September of 2020 and February of 2021. And there are more than just a couple of families out there that do that high wire act month after month after month after month.
So we are getting a couple audience questions about affordable housing options. So I'll kind of incorporate those into this next part of our discussion. So at the state level today, there's been kind of a renewed focus on affordable housing. The governor just in September allocated $100 million in American Rescue Plan funds toward affordable housing initiatives, and that's been a push this legislative session. But the focus on these affordable housing projects is on projects that the state might incentivize with workforce housing tax credits or low-income housing tax credits. But what does this focus mean in practice, and who's still kind of getting left out of the affordable housing conversation?
Well, go ahead, Allie.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, honestly, and the reality is that a lot of those programs actually, for example, with Habitat for Humanity, we can't access at all. Being on the home ownership side of things, we've historically been able to try to access some workforce housing tax credits. But now, even this cycle, that's not an option. So I think to be honest, we feel left out on the home ownership piece quite a bit. And the other piece of that is one thing that, a private sector for-profit developer is going to face on the affordable home ownership piece, at least in these communities, is the appraisal gaps. So that's something we haven't talked about an awful lot, but when the cost of construction is so astronomically high, and the values in the neighborhoods that where it actually would be affordable for a family to live are so depressed, it would take so much. Like, for example, in some of the neighborhoods that we're building in one of our target neighborhoods right now, our new construction 3-bedroom, 2-story home, about 1,150 square feet, cost us about $190,000, and that's with volunteer labor. And that house will hopefully appraise for about 125 to 130. So, that's a nonprofit affordable housing developer trying to bring home ownership opportunities in. A for-profit developer, there's no opportunity there to really make that math work, even with a generous, gap financing kind of structure. So, I think some of this stuff, workforce housing tax credits, 10%, whatever, not to discount those programs. I think they can be very good programs. I think we need them, but it's not the whole picture. It's not the full story. And there's a lot of other issues that folks like us are facing, trying to make this, workable and viable to continue to provide these opportunities.
Yeah, I think, Allie, the whole issue of the cost of new construction creates in and of itself all kinds of challenges. And of course, the appraisal gap that you talk about is one of them. And one of the things that for instance, the Polk County Housing Trust Fund does is actually fill that appraisal gap for the local Habitat affiliate, as well as some other nonprofit builders. But when you're talking about an appraisal gap of $50,000 or $60,000 a structure or a house, that gets awfully expensive, over time. And so it's going to be incumbent, I think, upon all of us to start thinking about what does housing look like in this state, owned housing look like in this state going forward, because I don't expect construction costs to go down significantly anytime soon. And so are we at a point where, as Iowans, we have to rethink what our idea of a home is? And are we starting to need to talk about smaller lots, about semi-detached dwellings, about, some people call it the missing middle. Certainly for those homeowners or families that are ownership qualified, then we can't continue to find public resources to fill $60,000 or $70,000 appraisal gaps across the state of Iowa. So how do we build in a different way? And I wish I had a magic wand that I could wave that would change our expectations, but I don't think that I don't have that wand, and I think it's going to take a while for Iowans to begin to change their expectation of what a home looks like.
Yeah, and Eric, in the meantime, I think there are other things we can do. I can't go forward with answering your question, Marissa, without first acknowledging that we are seeing some historic investments in affordable housing, rural broadband, other things like that at the state level. But it was our Democratic-led federal government that allocated this money, despite the objections of our governor and others who are now taking credit for spending it. So if you like these investments in rural broadband and affordable housing and other things, we need to show our support for the people who actually allocate that money to be spent, not just the people who spend it. And that's not, I mean, I'm not favoring one party over the other here. I'm saying any elected official should understand the benefits of investing this type of money in our infrastructure and be willing to put that money behind those plans. But, you know, I think we have to look more also at strategies that involve rehabilitation and preservation and acquisition of current housing. And how we make that current housing more affordable as well. In at least the short to medium term, we will probably not build our way out of an affordability problem, right? So we need to look at houses that already exist, multifamily buildings that already exist, and think about how to keep the prices of those homes affordable over the longer term. That might mean using public dollars to bring more currently private multifamily buildings under the stewardship of a mission-driven nonprofit that focuses on affordable housing, making sure that we've maxed out the number of public housing units that we're allowed to have, looking at other models like resident-owned cooperatives or other things like that. So we really need to look around at the housing stock we already have and think about how to make it more affordable to more people. Because again, given the current construction prices now and in the foreseeable future, it doesn't make a lot of financial sense to build more affordable units. We need to look at the ones we already have and repurpose them or lower their price.
Well, and I agree with that. And I think sometimes it's still a little bit easier said than done. We have a target area that we're working that has 1,450 properties, and 62% of them are over 81 years old, and quite a huge amount of square footage and quite a bit of density still. So, you know, there's still those houses have asbestos, they have all kinds of things, and definitely it's more cost effective on the rehabbing side. But to keep it affordable, those houses are large at times. So I think it's just helpful to know that there's some realities in neighborhoods in some of the areas that we live in the state of Iowa that do have a significant battle ahead of them to make the math work and make all of the things fit together so that we definitely need innovation.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question from the audience, someone was curious, you know, why don't we have in place some sort of requirement for developers that build higher rent places to have to accept, you know, like a certain percentage of low-income tenants?
Let's talk about state law a little bit. So I would say on the whole, Iowa ranks on the low end of having laws that allow or encourage things, programs or local ordinances that would incentivize or require more affordable housing. So I said a really long sentence there, but basically in Iowa, Johnson County, people joke about how liberal we are in Johnson County. We can't do anything more restrictive than what the state law says. So we can't pass additional requirements like rent control or requirements on developers. We just can't do that. There are lots of changes that would need to happen at the state level in terms of allowing more local control over the housing market, or changes in state law that incentivize or require more affordability. We also can look at the tenant landlord law and see that in Iowa, particularly for some residents, such as those in manufactured housing, landlords and landowners have far more rights than renters do. And so those are not things that we can fix with local advocacy. They need to be changes at the state level.
I will say that and approach that maybe in a little bit different way, and so maybe not as sort of draconian as saying you must accept certain tenants in your new development, but at least here locally, we have had some success in sort of a trade-off and a partnership, for instance, between the trust fund and the city of Des Moines. So the city of Des Moines has a policy on either new multifamily development or rehab of existing multifamily, that if the developer is seeking city assistance, and that's pretty broadly defined, city assistance, the city can then, in exchange for that special assistance, require the developer to include a certain number of affordable units in their multifamily development. Now, this is rental. Understand, this isn't owned condominium units, but and the sort of breaking point for our local developers is about a 60% affordability. So when I say that, I say that the units that they are in turn pricing in exchange for the city assistance need to be affordable to folks that make 60% between 100% and 60% of area median income. So it's not a huge leap for them or a reduction in rent in order to get that city assistance. What the trust fund has done over the past several years then is, with some success, is, in fact, there hasn't been one developer that has said, no, we don't want to do that. We have gone in and said, okay, well, if the city is going to require you to provide units at 10 units in your new development, affordable to folks that make 60% of area median income, what would you require as additional investment from the trust fund to buy down half of those 10 units, say 5 of them, to be affordable to families that make 30% or less of area median income, which of course now begins to make apartments affordable to households that are working in the service industry. Still not somebody that would make only minimum wage for 40 hours, but certainly make it affordable to those households that are making, in the $10 to $12 an hour, 40 hours a week. So there are ways, but so far that can't be compulsory. That would cause the problems that Sara was talking about. It can be voluntary, but it can also be a trade-off. So if you would like the city assistance, then these are what the city in turn would ask of you as a developer.
Yeah, and Eric, thanks for putting that more positive spin on what's possible. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the city of Iowa City has really been a leader in using those incentives as well. That's here in Johnson County. We have a single zone in our city that has an inclusionary zoning that everyone who's zoned in that area will provide 10% of their units as more affordable to lower income households for a period of 10 years. The reason that we can do that in that zone is because the developers have been given incentives such as reduced parking requirements, height bonuses, other things that help to balance out that equation. We have an annexation policy that new land that is brought into the city that's going to be used to build residential housing, provide a certain percentage of affordable housing in that new residential development. So we are certainly using the incentive side of things as aggressively as we can in many cases. It's not going to be enough I think it keeps us at a status quo, but it's not enough to turn the tide. And that's where I do get a bit impatient about the limitations that we have for other more aggressive strategies.
So I know oh, sorry, Eric, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. We can move on to other topics.
I was just gonna say, I know we only have about 8 minutes left, so do kind of want to begin to wrap things up for folks and leave people with some takeaways. From what you all see around Iowa, are there any models within our state or perhaps elsewhere around the country that you'd point to that show what that ideal picture looks like if secure housing is made available to everyone, and how do we get there?
Well, I guess I'll offer one observation that I think is probably helpful, and it's going back to what Allie was talking about earlier about this generational wealth and how home ownership can balance some of the inequities that we've seen in the past. And the thing to remember is that kind of a program of beginning people on a path or beginning families on a path of home ownership is really self-sustaining. So the fact is that some programs you're going to be paying for every single month. Other programs, if you make an initial investment, they become self-sustaining. So the fact is that if you start today with one person or one family as a homeowner building wealth, then that ultimately benefits their children and their grandchildren. And each of those folks, I'm a great example of that. Our first house was purchased with the proceeds of my grandmother and grandfather's house, when he decided after grandma died that he wanted to sell the house and move, into an assisted living center. And so they sold the house, and each of the grandkids got a portion of the proceeds, and all of us used it to put a down payment on our houses. Now you've got a whole nother generation. That one investment that he made caused then multiple generations after them to be able to do the same thing. So understand that there is there's a lot to recommend down payment assistance programs to help folks who are not homeowners get into the ownership arena.
I would echo that too. And what we've seen just in our community with what Habitat has been able to do, just one example, in 31 years, we've worked with almost 200 families to purchase homes. And we boast a 96% success rate over 31 years. In that, we've had very, very few of those families end up in foreclosure. And in addition to that, 85 or 86% of those families in 31 years are still living in their original homes today. So I think that really just speaks to that generational impact and how this does last a long time, but that investment in that one family. And the only other thing I would speak to is a model that we've watched for a while, but just not forgetting to think on the neighborhood level beyond just the single family and single home. But FCS Ministries out of Atlanta actually has a really interesting model that we've been watching and are trying to model some of our work after on the neighborhood level, where they've actually been able to take a very at-risk Atlanta neighborhood from 10% home ownership to 62% home ownership over the period of, I believe it was 15 to 20 years. And through some innovation and some new housing solutions and things like that, and some really interesting work that they've done. So I do think it's helpful to look at other models and places, outside of our backyard that, maybe they have an idea and a solution that might work.
Yeah. I say all the time, and so some of you have heard me say this before, that I work every day to put myself out of a job. Okay. We don't come to work because we love being in the middle of this problem. We come to work because we want to solve this problem. And I think that when we ask ourselves, what would Iowa look like if everyone had a safe, stable, and affordable home? We can really dream about what that might look like, and we should make it happen. And I do believe we can. For people who want to become homeowners, we have great examples for how to pave that path for them to home ownership and stable home ownership. For people who aren't ready or not interested in becoming homeowners, we know what works to make their housing affordable. So now what we need is the community commitment to do it. We need the funding, we need the municipal investment, we need our private partners to understand that they too will benefit from the initiatives that we're undertaking, and to invest in those in ways that reflect that benefit. If you're thinking about growing your workforce in Iowa and you're facing this problem of a housing shortage in an area, or housing that's not affordable for your employees, housing is a really simple equation at the end of the day. How much money do I earn? And how much does housing cost? Okay. And if our wages don't go up, then our housing costs have to stay low. So we are all connected in that equation. And so we need to all really get on board with figuring this out. And again, we know what works. We just have to put the investment behind it. Whether it's for an individual, family, or for a whole community, we will see the generational impact of these investments. Just like Eric and Allie said. So let's do it, is my feeling. And let me go back to working as a secretary, or maybe I want a job at the public library. I don't know, but we're gonna put ourselves out of work because we're gonna solve this problem. That's the goal every day.
And I know we just have 2 minutes left, but is there any final, suggestions for where people can go for resources and how to, get further engaged in this conversation?
Well, certainly if there are folks out there who either themselves individually or know people that are struggling right now, emergency rental assistance is still available. Those dollars are still there, and the best place to go for most folks on this call is going to be to the Iowa Finance Authority website. To those folks who may be listening from Polk County and Lynn County, I think that you can still get to those sites through the Iowa Finance Authority website. And I see Tracy Achenbach's on the call. I believe Lynn County now has a locally managed program for emergency rental assistance.
Yes.
That money is still available. So don't think that, oh, well, the money's gone and we're now on our own, because there is still rental assistance available out there for families that are facing a housing crisis.
Well, we are out of time for this session, but thank you again, Sara, Eric, and Allie, for joining us today. And thank you for those of you who've tuned in. As a reminder, next up is a fresh look at community in the community development track or controversial topics in education in the DEI track, where you're welcome to explore other sessions. Have a great Iowa Ideas and rest of your day, and thanks again.
Thank you, Marissa. Thanks, Eric and Allie.
Yep. Thanks for your work.
Thank you.